Hey, I'm Bob at ILikeToMakeStuff. Today we're gonna make a Lego build table. I started this project with the bottom shelf, and I started that shelf with the outside frame. That frame was made from 1x pine. I marked out the sizes on the boards to make sure that I could get the cuts I wanted out of each one, but really I just cut one piece and then used it as a template to cut the next one to make sure that they were all exactly the same length. I did this for the long sides and the short ends. I didn't want the shelf to be this thick, so I ripped all of these pieces down to the right thickness. Then I moved the fence over and cut a few smaller strips to act as supports underneath the shelf. The shelf surface itself was made from a piece of 1/2-inch plywood, which I cut down to size. With all the pieces cut, I laid everything out to make sure everything fit correctly. I set in the supports just to see where they would go. Everything looked good, so I added some glue and set all the pieces in place. I added some brad nails to most of these joints and to the piece of plywood just to hold it all together while the glue was drying. That way I could keep working. I added the supports with the glue and brads in the same way, and these are going to help the plywood not to sag over time. This was finished, so I made another one. I cut down 8 pieces of the same pine to use for the legs. On one of them I marked 1.5 inches from the edge and drew a diagonal to the opposite corner. That diagonal helped me set this taper jig and get it in the right position so that I could run the piece of wood through the blade at an angle. It takes a little adjusting and some test cuts are good, but once you get it set, you can put all the rest of the pieces through and they'll all be cut at the same angle. I cut all 8 pieces down with the same angle. Now 2 of these pieces are going to go together to make a leg, and that's going to make the leg thicker on one side than the other, but that is intentional here. I added some glue and clamped these together. While I was clamping them, I tried really hard to keep that joint flush on the outside. It just cuts down on sanding and everything I would have to do later. I did all 4 legs the same way and let them dry. I laid the bottom shelf in place and set the legs around the corners. Holding them in place, I drilled a hole through the leg and into the bottom frame. I pushed a dowel in to hold those in position to drill the other side. Then I pulled the dowel out, added some glue to the inside of the leg, put it in place, and then glued in some longer dowels into both holes. I knocked these in with a mallet to make sure that they went into the shelf and not just into the leg. I followed this same process for all 4 of the legs, and then after they dried, used a flush cut saw to trim off the excess dowel. I used some spacers cut to the same length in each one of the corners and laid down the upper shelf on top of them. I followed the same process to add dowels for the top shelf, but in this case I left all the dowels in place until I had all the holes drilled on each leg, and went back and glued up and added dowels at the end all at the same time. This just helped make sure that everything stayed aligned. Then I cut down some thicker pieces of plywood to use as the wraparound for the top of the table. These are going to have mitered edges, so I put on my crosscut sled and used a digital angle gauge to set my blade to exactly 45 degrees. I cut a miter on one end and then clamped a speed square right up against that cut. From the speed square I could measure where the opposite end needed to be cut. I did this for all 4 pieces and then held them up into place to make sure that I had them cut correctly. I clamped them up to make sure that the miters matched before I went back and glued up all the corners. I added glue to the miter itself and to the faces that were going to be touching the legs. Then I clamped everything in place to dry. If you take your time and are really precise about setting the angle of your blade, you can get really nice miter cuts on a crosscut sled. Also, you want to creep up on your cuts and make sure you don't cut things too short so you have a gap in the corner. Next I made the inside storage area of the table, and this was made out of 2 strips of 1/2-inch plywood and then a big sheet of 1/2-inch plywood. I cut these down to fit inside of the table and just added some glue on 2 sides and clamped the pieces upright using some corner clamps. These things are pretty inexpensive, a couple of bucks a piece, but they're really handy for clamping things at 90-degree angles. I shot some brads in to hold these surfaces together while the glue dried. I could have clamped it just as well. After it dried, I was ready to put it in place, but I had to measure in from the outside on both sides of this table to figure out where it went. I added some glue to the edges that were going to contact and slid it down into place. Again, I used the corner clamps to hold this in position while everything dried. The last big piece to make was the top, and it was made out of 3/4-inch plywood with a 1x frame. I cut down the pieces for the frame and mitered all the corners in the same process that I did before. I snuck up on the cuts to make sure that they were nice and tight. And then I put the dado stack on the table saw so I could cut a slot inside the frame for the plywood to fit into. I did a test fit with a piece of plywood to make sure that it would fit great, so I went ahead and cut the same slot in all the other pieces. top of this table is going to be split in half so it can open. So I took the long pieces of the 1x and found the center point and cut them both at the same time so they would be exactly the same. I also cut the plywood in half. I added glue to all the surfaces on the inside of the dado and onto the miters. Then I fit the pieces around the plywood, making sure to line up the corners as best as I could. Again, holding it in place with the corner clamps. To mount the tabletop, I added drawer slides to the long sides of the table. I marked its placement with them opening away from the table itself. Then I pre-drilled the holes and screwed them in place. These are soft close too, so if you slam them, they stop before they close all the way, and then they close slowly on their own. This will stop little fingers from getting squished in the doors. Once I had both of them on, I laid a spacer in place and then set my tabletop on top of it. From the bottom, I pulled out the slides to their full extension and then screwed them into the tabletop. I had to go back and adjust these to get it to slide smoothly, but after I did, I ran over the entire table with sandpaper and a sanding pad and then cleaned it off with a tack cloth. I added a couple of coats of polyacrylic just to protect it a little bit from the kids. And then it was time to add Legos. I laid the sheets on and they didn't fit. It turns out that a 15 by 15 inch panel is actually 15 1/16 square. So I took it to the sander and trimmed off that 16th on every panel. I laid a brick across the panels to make sure that they were spaced evenly because that matters as well, and that helped me get all 6 panels laid out correctly. The 2 in the middle I had to cut in half, and so I ripped them in half and then went back and sawed off a 16th right down the center. I kind of deburred it with a sanding block and then fit the pieces in place. I kept the blocks connecting all these panels to hold them in position, that way I could move them out of the way pretty easily. I taped off the rim and sprayed some spray adhesive over the entire surface. I didn't want the spray adhesive to be on the rim, that's why I taped it off. I wasn't sure if the spray adhesive would be strong enough here to hold them in place, and it actually was in most cases, but there were a few places where it wasn't evenly sprayed out. I used some super glue to hold down any places that were a little loose. Another option is to use spray adhesive on both surfaces before you stick it together and you get a stronger bond. After these were down, it was finished, and then it was time to dump in all the Legos. Turns out that my kids have more Legos than I realized. Sponsorships help me make these videos, and this one is sponsored by HelloFresh. HelloFresh is a meal kit delivery service. So each week, they send you out all the ingredients that you need, a really fantastic recipe, and step-by-step instructions. All the ingredients are really fresh, and they actually tell you where they come from, which is pretty cool. But all the ingredients, the meat, the vegetables, everything come in an insulated box that they ship to you, and they come in pre-portioned amounts, so you're not paying for food that you're not going to use. The recipes are really good, and some of them are even by Jamie Oliver. They only take about 30 minutes to prepare, and they are easy enough for anybody to make, no matter if you know how to cook or you're like me and you don't know how to cook. It's a great way to get a fresh, healthy meal so you don't have to spend a ton of time in the kitchen and you don't have to spend that time at the store. I have a big family, so this is really nice to have a healthy meal planned out for a few days a week that we don't have to worry about. We know that it's gonna be there, we're gonna have everything we need to cook it. So if you're like me and you're really busy, it's handy in that way. It's also handy if you just don't like going to the store and having to worry about making sure that you get all the right ingredients. So be sure to go to HelloFresh, use the code MAKESTUFF to get $35 off your first week of deliveries. It's good stuff, go check them out. Thanks HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. We finally got a chance to play on the table last night. The kids enjoyed it quite a bit, and I was really happy with how it turned out. I did find a couple of things that I think I would like to change if I were to make another one. One, I would probably look at some different drawer slides than I got because these seem to have a little bit of slop in them, and so each side of the table can kind of shift back and forth a little bit. Not a real big deal, but when you push them together, sometimes they don't quite line up and you have to nudge them a little bit to get them to line up. Another thing I think I might add in the future is a way to lock the tables in their outward position. It's a little weird to have them moving underneath you if you're trying to play, so it'd be nice to be able to lock them out and slide them in. Of course, we've got the shelves down below to hold more containers of the Legos because we ended up with a lot more in this bin than I thought we were gonna have. So we can get some bigger bins and fill them up and slide them underneath if we need to add more storage. Also, those shelves are gonna be used for the kids to be able to put things that they are currently working on that they don't want to get destroyed. They can put them down there in the shelves to kind of keep them out of the way. I did make some plans for this table and they are available for sale on my website. You can go get them right here. On those plans, I made a small update. I updated the size of the whole top so that you don't have to sand down these panels. You still have to cut the section down the middle, but you should just be able to drop in 2 by 3 panels and they'll fit right on the top. So be sure to check my website to get those plans. I've also got a lot of other videos that you might be interested in, as well as links to all my social stuff down there. That's it for this one. I hope you like it and I'd love to know what you think about it in the comments below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.